At the beginning of the 20th century, a dangerous idea took hold in the United States, and it did not arrive screaming. It arrived dressed as science, stamped with authority, and praised as progress. The belief was simple and terrifying. Human beings could be improved the same way farmers improved crops and livestock. Those deemed unfit should not be allowed to reproduce. Those considered strong should multiply. And if the state had to intervene to make that happen, so be it. This idea was called eugenics. It did not begin as a fringe belief. It did not start in back rooms or radical circles. It began in universities, medical journals, lecture halls, and government offices. It was debated calmly, taught seriously, and embraced publicly. Newspapers discussed it as the future of society. Politicians praised it as responsible governance. Doctors described it as compassionate, and many ordinary Americans accepted it without question. The roots of eugenics trace back to the late 19th century, when rapid industrialization, mass immigration, and urban poverty unsettled American society. Cities were overcrowded, crime was visible, mental illness and disability were poorly understood, public institutions were overwhelmed. Many people wanted simple explanations for complex problems, and eugenics offered exactly that. Supporters claimed poverty was inherited, crime was inherited, mental illness was inherited, disability was inherited. If these traits could be stopped at the source, society could be cleansed of them within a few generations. The solution, they argued, was not charity or reform, but control over who was allowed to have children. This thinking drew heavily from a distorted interpretation of evolutionary theory. Natural selection, stripped of its scientific limits and moral context, was repackaged into social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest was no longer a description of nature. It became a prescription for society. Those who succeeded were declared genetically superior. Those who struggled were labeled biologically defective. Eugenics advocates framed this as modern, rational, and humane. They spoke in numbers, charts, and pedigrees. They created family trees that marked people as normal or defective. They categorized entire populations using vague labels like feeble-minded, unfit, degenerate, or morally weak. These were not medical diagnoses, they were judgments, and they carried consequences. By the early 1900s, eugenics had entered American academic life. Prestigious universities taught it as legitimate science. Textbooks explained how intelligence, behavior, and morality were passed down through bloodlines. Students were trained to identify supposed genetic flaws in families and communities. These students would become doctors, lawyers, social workers, and policymakers. The language of eugenics was calm and persuasive. It avoided violence in its wording. It promised prevention rather than punishment. It claimed to protect society rather than harm individuals. It positioned itself as a public health measure, not a moral crusade. This language mattered because it made the idea easy to accept. At the same time, eugenics spread beyond academia and into popular culture. State fairs hosted contests that ranked babies and families based on physical appearance, intelligence, and background. Winners received medals and public praise. These events were advertised as wholesome and educational. They were designed to normalize the belief that human worth could be measured and ranked. Magazines published articles explaining how to identify good genes. Pamphlets warned about the dangers of allowing the wrong people to reproduce. Public lectures drew large audiences. Churches and women's organizations sometimes endorsed the message, believing they were supporting social improvement. What made eugenics especially powerful was how it aligned with existing prejudices. Immigrants arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe were portrayed as genetically inferior. People living in poverty were blamed for their condition. Those with disabilities were treated as burdens rather than individuals. Eugenics did not challenge these beliefs. It reinforced them with the illusion of scientific proof. Supporters insisted this was not about cruelty. They claimed it was about responsibility. They argued that preventing the birth of supposedly defective children would reduce suffering, lower public costs, and improve the nation's future. They rarely spoke about the people being labeled. They spoke about statistics, trends, and projections. The speed at which eugenics gained acceptance was striking. Within a few decades, an idea that would later be associated with some of the worst crimes in history was widely regarded as enlightened policy. There was little public resistance. There was no national debate about consent or human rights. Those questions were simply ignored. By the time the movement reached its peak, the groundwork had already been laid. The theory had been taught. The language had been normalized. The public had been conditioned to believe that some lives mattered less than others. The transition from belief to action did not require outrage. It required paperwork. By the time eugenics moved beyond theory, it did not announce itself as something new. It simply slipped into daily life. It appeared in classrooms, churches, newspapers, and public events until it felt ordinary. By the 1910s and 1920s, eugenics was no longer an idea being debated. It was an assumption being acted upon. American universities played a central role in this shift. Colleges taught eugenics as settled science, not speculation. Courses trained students to identify hereditary defects and trace them through generations. Charts and family trees were used to show how traits like intelligence, criminal behavior, alcoholism, and sexual immorality supposedly passed from parent to child. Graduates carried these beliefs into medicine, law, education, and social work. Medical professionals embraced the movement with confidence. Doctors published papers claiming they could identify genetic inferiority through behavior, appearance, and background. Mental health professionals categorized patients using broad, unscientific labels. Social workers were trained to flag families considered undesirable. These evaluations often relied on bias, not evidence, but they were treated as objective assessments. Eugenics did not stay behind institutional walls. It entered public life through spectacle. State fairs hosted competitions known as Better Baby and Fitter Family Contest. Families were examined, measured, questioned, and scored. Physical traits, intelligence tests, and family histories were evaluated. Winners received trophies and public recognition. Losers were quietly marked. These events were framed as wholesome and educational. They attracted crowds. Parents entered proudly. Children were praised or dismissed based on arbitrary standards. The underlying message was clear and repeated often. Human value could be quantified. Some families were assets to society, others were liabilities. Newspapers and magazines reinforced this message. Articles praised eugenics as forward thinking. Headlines warned about the dangers of unchecked reproduction among the unfit. Editorials argued that charity only prolonged social problems. Eugenics was presented as a solution that required courage, not cruelty. Religious and civic organizations sometimes joined in. Certain church leaders supported eugenics as a way to strengthen families and reduce suffering. Women's groups promoted it as a moral duty. Reformers believed they were addressing social decay through prevention rather than punishment. Few questioned who defined fitness or who bore the cost. Language mattered. Eugenics avoided words like force and coercion. Instead, it spoke of protection, improvement, and responsibility. It described intervention as kindness. This framing softened resistance and made opposition seem outdated or emotional. Those who questioned eugenics were portrayed as sentimental or ignorant of science. At the same time, immigration debates intensified. Large numbers of newcomers arrived from regions already viewed with suspicion. Eugenics provided a convenient explanation for social tension. Crime rates, poverty, and overcrowding were blamed on genetics rather than policy or economics. Calls for restriction grew louder, backed by charts and studies claiming to prove biological inferiority. Public trust in authority figures allowed eugenics to spread rapidly. Doctors were believed, professors were respected, judges were assumed to be fair. When these figures spoke in unison, dissent faded. The idea that experts could manage society more efficiently than individuals managed their own lives became widely accepted. Eugenics also appealed to fear of degeneration, fear of decline, fear that the nation was weakening from within. Supporters warned that without intervention, society would be overwhelmed by defectives. These warnings were speculative, but they were delivered with confidence and repetition. By the early 1920s, eugenics had achieved something rare. It united progressives and conservatives, reformers and bureaucrats, scientists and politicians. Different groups supported it for different reasons, but the outcome was the same. The belief that the state had a role in controlling reproduction became normal. This normalization mattered more than any single law or speech. Once the public accepted the premise that some people should not have children, the next step did not require persuasion. It required implementation. Committees formed, policies were drafted, institutions prepared. The idea had settled in, it was respected, it was trusted, and it was ready to be enforced. Once eugenics was accepted as normal, the shift from belief to enforcement happened quietly. There was no single announcement, no national vote, no moment when the country stopped to consider what it was authorizing. Laws were written state by state, procedures were standardized, authority was delegated, and from that point forward, decisions about reproduction were no longer personal, they were administrative. The first sterilization laws appeared in the early 1900s. They targeted people labeled as mentally unfit, chronically ill, epileptic, criminal, or feeble-minded. These categories were broad by design. They allowed officials wide discretion. A diagnosis could be based on behavior, poverty, school performance, or hearsay. Once labeled, a person could be selected for sterilization with little recourse. Institutions became the engine of enforcement. Mental hospitals, prisons, reform schools, and homes for the disabled were the primary sites. People confined in these facilities had few rights and less visibility. Many were committed involuntarily. Some were children. Some were institutionalized for reasons that had nothing to do with mental illness, including poverty, pregnancy out of wedlock, or being considered difficult to manage. Sterilization was framed as treatment. Patients were told it would improve their health, calm their behavior, or help them reintegrate into society. In many cases, they were not told what the procedure would do. Consent forms, when used at all, were meaningless. Refusal was often impossible. Cooperation was rewarded. Resistance was punished. Doctors performed the procedures. Judges authorized them. Administrators tracked the numbers. The process was bureaucratic and efficient. Files were opened. Decisions were recorded. Operations were scheduled. Once completed, cases were closed and archived. Lives were altered permanently with the same detachment used to process inventory. By the 1920s, forced sterilization had spread across much of the United States. Dozens of states passed laws allowing it. Tens of thousands of people were targeted. The majority were poor. Many were women. Disproportionate numbers came from minority communities. These patterns were not accidental. They reflected who had the least power to resist. The legal foundation for this system was solidified in 1927, when the United States Supreme Court ruled that compulsory sterilization was constitutional. The case involved a young woman labeled feeble-minded and institutionalized by the state. The court ruled against her. The decision affirmed that the state's interest outweighed individual rights. The ruling sent a clear message. Forced sterilization was not an abuse of power. It was lawful. It was legitimate. It was endorsed at the highest level. After the decision, sterilization programs expanded rather than slowed. The legal question had been settled. There was no longer a need for hesitation. What makes this period especially disturbing is how routine it became. Sterilization was not reserved for extreme cases, it was used as a tool of management. People were sterilized to reduce institutional populations, lower costs, and prevent future dependence. Some were promised release if they complied. Others were sterilized shortly before discharge, ensuring they could never form families afterward. Many victims never knew what had been done to them. Others found out years later, often when they tried to have children. Medical records were sealed or destroyed. Apologies were rare. Compensation was non-existent. The system moved on without acknowledgement. There was little public outcry. Newspapers reported sterilization numbers as progress. Officials spoke proudly of reduced burdens on the state. Eugenics advocates cited the growing totals as proof of success. Each procedure was counted as a victory for society, not a violation of a person. By the time concerns began to surface, the damage was already done. Entire generations had been affected. Bloodlines had been ended. The people most harmed were those least likely to be heard. Their stories remained buried in institutional files marked complete. Once the system was in motion, patterns became impossible to ignore. Eugenics was presented as neutral science, but its application was anything but neutral. The same groups appeared again and again in sterilization records. The same communities were targeted. The same justifications were reused. This was not random. It was selective. Race played a central role. Black Americans were disproportionately labeled as unfit, particularly in the South. Poverty, limited education, and segregation were reframed as genetic failure rather than the result of discrimination. Medical professionals and social workers interpreted social conditions as biological defects. Entire communities were treated as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. Native Americans were also targeted. In some cases, sterilizations were performed through federal and state institutions that claimed to provide care. Women were sterilized without proper explanation or consent. Language barriers, isolation, and dependency on government services made resistance nearly impossible. These actions further reduced already vulnerable populations. Immigrants faced similar scrutiny. Those arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe were frequently described as inferior stock. Intelligence tests administered in English were used to justify these claims, despite being incomprehensible to many test takers. Low scores were recorded as proof of hereditary weakness. These results were then cited in arguments for immigration restriction and reproductive control. Women bore a disproportionate share of the consequences. Young women deemed promiscuous, rebellious, or difficult were often labeled feeble minded. Pregnancy outside of marriage was treated as evidence of genetic defect. Girls were institutionalized for behavior that would not have raised concern in boys. Once confined, sterilization followed. Disability was another major target. People with physical disabilities, epilepsy, mental illness, or developmental delays were viewed as burdens. Rather than improving care or accessibility, the state focused on preventing their existence altogether. The assumption was that these lives were inherently less valuable and that society was better off without future generations like them. Economic status often determined fate. Wealthy families rarely appeared in sterilization records. Poor families appeared frequently. Poverty itself was treated as a hereditary condition. Families receiving public assistance were scrutinized. Children from these families were monitored and sometimes institutionalized. Once labeled, the path to sterilization was short. The criminal justice system reinforced these patterns. Inmates were sterilized as part of sentencing or rehabilitation. Minor offenses could lead to permanent consequences. The goal was not justice, it was prevention. The state aimed to stop future criminals by eliminating the possibility of their birth. What tied these targets together was power. Eugenics focused on those with the least ability to object, those without lawyers, those without money, those without public sympathy. The system relied on silence, isolation, and authority. It functioned best where oversight was weakest. Officials claimed this targeting was practical. They argued that intervention where it mattered most would produce the greatest benefit. In reality, it revealed the true purpose of the program. Eugenics was not about improving humanity. It was about controlling populations considered inconvenient or undesirable. This selective enforcement stripped the movement of its scientific facade. If genetics were truly the concern, enforcement would have been even and evidence-based. Instead, it followed existing social hierarchies. It reinforced racism, sexism, and class division while pretending to solve them. As these practices continued, their effects compounded. Families were broken, communities lost generations. The damage extended far beyond the individuals. Entire groups were diminished through policy, not chance. Eugenics did not collapse in a single moment. It did not end with trials, public apologies, or a national reckoning. Instead, it faded, quietly, gradually, almost conveniently. When the world learned what Nazi Germany had done in the name of racial purity, the word eugenics became radioactive. American institutions did not confront their role. They distanced themselves from the label while leaving much of the system intact. After World War II, public language shifted. Eugenics was no longer celebrated openly, but the laws that enabled it often remained. Sterilization statutes stayed on the books. Institutions continued to operate. Procedures continued under different names, framed as medical necessity, population control, or patient welfare. The philosophy went underground, but the practice did not immediately stop. In several states, forced sterilizations continued into the 1950s and 1960s. In some cases, they continued even later. Victims included prisoners, people with disabilities, women receiving public assistance, and patients in state-run facilities. Many were never told what was done to them. Others were misled or coerced. Oversight was minimal. Accountability was rare. There was no widespread effort to notify victims. Records were sealed or destroyed. Institutions avoided publicity. Politicians avoided discussion. The country moved forward without looking back. Eugenics became an uncomfortable footnote rather than a central chapter in American history. When challenges did arise, they were often isolated. Lawsuits were dismissed. Claims were denied. Survivors struggled to be believed. Many had spent years being told they were unfit, unreliable, or incapable. Speaking out required confronting the same institutions that had already taken so much from them. It was not until decades later that some states began to acknowledge what had happened. A handful issued formal apologies. A few established compensation programs, though many victims had already died by the time these measures were offered. Payments, when provided, could never restore what was taken. They arrived late, quietly, and unevenly. The lack of national recognition allowed the story to disappear from public memory. Eugenics was rarely taught in schools. Textbooks skimmed past it or framed it as a brief mistake quickly corrected. The scale was minimized. The victims were anonymized. The systems that enabled it were left largely unquestioned. This forgetting mattered. It allowed the myth to persist that such abuses were foreign, extreme, or isolated. It obscured the reality that eugenics was legal, organized, and supported by respected institutions. It prevented meaningful reflection on how easily rights can be stripped when authority, fear, and false science align. The legacy of eugenics is not limited to sterilization records. It lives on in mistrust of medical systems, particularly among communities that were targeted. It lives on in policies that frame social problems as biological flaws. It lives on in the assumption that some lives are worth less investment than others. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of eugenics is not how it began, but how it ended. There was no reckoning proportionate to the harm, no national moment of shame, no widespread accountability. The system dissolved without closure, leaving survivors to carry the burden alone. Eugenics was not a secret at the time. It was public policy. It was celebrated. It was enforced. Its disappearance from memory was not accidental. It was convenient. And that is why it matters to remember it now. This was not ancient history. It was modern. It was American. It was legal. And it happened because too many people trusted authority over humanity, efficiency over dignity, and silence over responsibility. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.